Earlier this month, the United Nations produced its Human Development Report, and as you scan the bottom of that league table of human development, you very quickly come across a grim pattern, because the bottom 24 places out of over 170 countries in the world are filled by African countries. A few months ago, when it was announced that some 8 million people at least were at risk of starvation in the Horn of Africa in Ethiopia, there was no real sense of shock, no real sense of amazement that this human catastrophe could be going on at such a high scale. The Economist magazine, the boss's magazine in Britain, in May produced an issue of which the front cover had as the headline, "Hopeless Africa." And there's a sense that Africa exists on the edge of a precipice, that here you have a continent which is continually nearing the possibility of virtual extinction. A human catastrophe, a social catastrophe, a political catastrophe. Now, I should say at the start that Africa is a massive generalisation. Algeria is very different to Namibia. Burkina Faso is very different to Mozambique. Madagascar is very different to Uganda. But nonetheless, if you look at the whole of Africa, it's impossible to ignore the social emergency, the political emergency, the economic failure that is going on in that continent. You're familiar with the figures, but let me remind you of what the World Bank itself found in its report which was published about 6 weeks ago. A report which sets out from the authors of African economic policy. Remember, the World Bank and the IMF, through the Structural Adjustment Programme, have essentially run African economic policy for 39 out of the 44 countries for the majority of the last 25 years. And the people who have been responsible for much of the policy of that time themselves admit that something around 13,000 children under the age of 5 die every day from malnutrition and the diseases associated with malnutrition. 13,000, a conservative estimate, but let's assume that's the reality. It shows that half the population live on less than 65 pence a day. It shows that the total income of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, except for South Africa, is less than the national income of Belgium. That it has fewer roads than Poland. That in the era of the internet, there are fewer than 5 million telephones in the whole of the continent of Africa. And that over half the population of Africa have, let alone logged on, never made a telephone call. That's the reality of a continent which in large measure has been abandoned by sections of international capitalism. Africa now accounts for something like 1% of global gross domestic product, a continent which makes up something like 17% of the world's population, 1% of global gross domestic product, and less than 2% of world trade flows through Africa. And not simply in the most developed products, computers, cars and so on, but even in products where Africa was thought to be a leader in the past, you can see a reining back, a fall in its share of world markets, so that if you take something like cocoa, for example, 30 years ago, Africa was responsible for 70% of the world's cocoa production. Today, it's responsible for 40% of the world's cocoa production. Now, that stark human emergency, which really, the AIDS conference that's gathering in Durban at the moment, Durban in South Africa at the moment, is one of the sharpest aspects of the incredible prediction made that half of the children who are now 15 in South Africa will die of AIDS. Half of those who are aged 15 in South Africa. The fact that in Malawi, the incredible report that a woman suffering from AIDS, the very basic treatment required to have her sores washed with salt water, was unable to have the treatment because she couldn't afford the salt that was required in the hospital. Incredible emergency that's happening across Africa. What's the responses to it? From the ruling class, from non-socialists, there are essentially two responses. The first is carry on as we are now. Carry on regardless. Things are really not that bad. There's a man called Callisto Maldavo, who is the World Bank Vice President for Africa, who introduces the World Bank report by saying the following. If you look at what we've been doing recently, you can see that actually we're on the right track. Well, thank God they're not on the wrong track then. That's all I can say, if that's the reality of Africa today. The second response is pessimism, utter pessimism. That, whenever you read about Africa, Frequently they rehearse Heart of Darkness. Conrad's actually a very good book about colonialism in Africa. Dub Africa as the heart of darkness. There's something about this continent which makes it impossible to develop. It's impossible to move forward. There's something deep in the bones of African people which makes them incapable of raising themselves to the level of the rest of the world. The economist in that issue I spoke about put it very well. Does Africa have some inherent character flaw that makes it incapable of development? And of course, really, this is a rehearsal of racism, let's be clear about it. That here you have a continent of 750 million people, most of them black, and clearly the reason why they're poor is because they are black. This is really what large numbers of the ruling class critique of Africa begins from, even though it may not spell it out in that way. And therefore I think it's incumbent upon us to spell out the real causes of starvation in Africa, the real causes of poverty in Africa, the real causes of the social emergency, but also to put forward a programme of hope, to put forward a programme of how things could be different. And the first lie to take on is the idea that Africa starves because there is too little food. Now, on a world scale, there's no doubt at all that there's enough food to feed the world. Everyone knows this. Every report that's ever been produced shows that population growth is much lower than the growth in the food production that's happened over the last 25 years. On a world scale, there's no doubt about this. But even on an African scale, you can't argue there is too little food to feed people. The majority of countries of sub-Saharan Africa are exporters of food, not importers of food. Throughout the 1980s, the growth in exports of food was much greater than the growth of imports of food in sub-Saharan Africa. Even in the Sahel, which is the dry, semi-arid region underneath the Saharan desert, top left of Africa, even there, the Sahelian countries were net exporters of food, even during the famine years of the mid-1980s. And therefore, really, the majority of African countries, even in periods of famine, are replaying the experience of Ireland during the 1845 to 49 famine, when massive amounts were food, even though massive amounts of food were exported, even though 1 million Irish people died during the famine years. That's the reality of the notion that there's too little food. There's plenty of food on a world scale, and on an African scale, there is also plenty of food. The second notion is that really humanity has reached its potential in Africa, and it's impossible to develop beyond where we are at the moment, linked to the notion of overpopulation. The incredible thing about Africa is that very little of the land that could be used for agriculture is actually used for crop production. I mean, even if you take into account the land that is used purely for cash crops, for tobacco, for flowers, for those sorts of things, nonetheless, in large parts of Africa, less than 0.5% of the fertile, less than 50%, less than half of the fertile land is actually used for agricultural production. In a country like Chad, 10% of the fertile land is used for agriculture. If you look at Sudan, Somalia, Mali, Ethiopia, in all of those countries, less than half of land that could be used for agriculture is actually used for agriculture. And the reason is because of the forms of land tenure, because of the fact that there isn't fertilizers available, there's not credit available for farmers, there's not the equipment available for them to do it. And because of that, you have this incredible potential of land which is actually better than the majority of land in Europe in some of these areas, which could be used to feed people, which is not even used for agricultural production. There is the notion as well that Africa is overpopulated. And the remarkable thing about Africa is that any examination of Africa, you very quickly come to the conclusion that the problem with Africa, it has not enough people rather than too many people.